Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video. This is a recent reads. Voice of the Fish by Lars, which is non-fiction. Max Porter's new novel, Shy. Roberto Arlt, Argentinian writer from the 20s and 30s. The 7 Madmen and the Flamethrowers, which I'll explain. It's 2 titles but it's really 1 book. And then 3 works of poetry. Was It For This? By Hannah Sullivan. The Illustrated Woman by Helen Mort. And a Polish poet called Andrej Kotanski. Poems About My Psychiatrist. And this was translated by Charles S. Kraszewski. And I would say that the Arlt had 2 translators for the different titles. Naomi Lindstrom translated the 7 Madmen parts, which is sort of part 1, and Larry Riley translated the Flamethrowers, which is part 2. But I'm going to start with non-fiction, unusually for me. It's been a bit of a lean pickings week in fiction, so the best thing I read was this. Lars is a trans-masculine author, and this book is partly about that, but he is actually his body, or he feels alienated from his body by more than just its gender assignment. And that's what I really sort of found valuable from this book, that it's not concentrating on one aspect of sort of physical alienation. There are many that he feels about his body. He swims every day. He's sort of he wants his body to be in constant motion, flow, movement. He's attracted to water, obviously, and sort of has a sort of spiritual link to sort of fish and marine life. So when he was first in Russia, he was a Russian speaker, but he found the country so homophobic that when he was in Georgia, Russia was the only common language, because he spoke English but not Georgian, and the Georgians didn't speak much English. He refused to use Russian, except he would eagerly learn the Russian names for the local species of fish there. So he identifies in a way with water, and after all, we are 60% water, and some parts of us are sort of 75%, 80%. It's only really our bone mass, our bone density, that brings the average down. And it's almost like he's trying to get in contact with that and express that. That's the alienation he feels, that, you know, although he's someone who leads a bit of a peripatetic lifestyle, winds up in many different places, speaks many different languages, he still feels restricted by, you know, the everyday things that we have to do in order to function as physical bodies. So there's also lots of sort of historical references, particularly to the sort of ancient Greeks and Romans, their writings on sort of particularly on nature, on fish, on things of the sea, on mythical beasts. Obviously the fish was a very important symbol to the early Christians. So there's quite a lot of that sort of slightly sort of factual stuff that dots in between his sort of recording events and linking things across time and things that happen to him and linking them. But the other part of this book, and the really intriguing bit, I feel, is his mother was an artist who photographed using him as her model as a child, and he was put in these sort of tableaus and scenes around death. So, for example, he had to sit in a bar full of dead shrimp. She took 14 plaster casts of his body at various times in his upbringing. The first one was at age 4, and the description of that plaster cast process and how suffocating, I mean, it's suffocating to read. Imagine the weight of that plaster pressing in on you and constricting your breathing. I mean, it's tantamount to abuse. It really is. And then you begin to ask, well, with such an upbringing, is it any wonder that he felt alienated from his body when, you know, that body was his mother's plaything and sort of, you know, manipulable thing for her, these sort of photographic tableaus. Very, very interesting and quite alarming in many ways. So I gave this 5 stars. And on to Max Porter, Shy. So I have tried with Max Porter. I've tried so hard. You know, the darling of contemporary English letters. His publishers throw so much support behind him in you know, what they're prepared to do typographically, that, you know, must raise the cost of producing a book. So, for example, there's lots of different fonts and sizes, and you get things like that. And as with Lanny, I asked myself, well, it looks very nice, but what's the point of it? So with Lanny, that had lots of spiralling text in its typography, and that made sense because it was a small village and all the sort of gossipy voices and the voice of the supernatural being. And then it didn't feature in parts 2 and parts 3. So you wonder, well, that's all very nice, but what's the point of it? Here, I think these different typography styles are to present different voices in the head of the protagonist, who's called Shy, who's a teenage boy, who's in the last chance school because his violence gets him thrown out of all the other schools. But he's not schizophrenic. These are not schizophrenic voices. These are remembered fragments of advice that everyone in his life gives him to try and deal with it. And, you know, some of them are those voices, such as his stepfather is motivated by more, well, you know, you've got to behave because otherwise what will people think of us? We'll get a bad reputation. So there's his mother, his stepfather, other boys in this last chance school, his older cousin Shane, who turns him on to jungle music and drum and bass music, which he really, really likes and loves because it seems to represent the pulsing turmoil in his own head. It seems to mirror that. And that is in the writing in parts, but not enough, I feel. Then there's all the helpers and carers and teachers at this last chance school, and they've all got things to contribute to say. And we get a snapshot of this troubled boy, but there's no movement, even though it does sort of build up to quite a well choreographed mass sort of letting out of anger in Shy and all the other boys who share his sort of fate in this school. But then at the end of that, so what? What have we learned? Nothing. What, you know, there's been no development. We've had this portrait of an angry young boy, but we've never really got to the bottom of it. Maybe that's the point. Maybe you can't get to the bottom of it. But I'm so annoyed with myself that twice I've been you know, I didn't want to pick up Lanny for the longest time because it had supernatural folklore themes, which just do not interest me at all. But I fell prey to the catnip of, oh, it's got really interesting typography, which it does. And this, the same thing was, oh, it's got interesting layout on the page, which actually it hasn't. I mean, it's not really doing what, at least Lanny was doing something with sort of sentence structure by curling it and making it a helix, whereas here you've just got different fonts and sizes and some are in italics and stuff. But I fell for it, and I sort of hate myself for it. I've got to resist whatever is thrown at me in his next book, because I get nothing from this author, I'm afraid. Absolutely nothing. 2 stars. And on to the 7 Madmen and the Flamethrowers. So let's deal with the title first of all. This is one book, but Arlt needed money, and so he got the first part published as the 7 Madmen before he'd completed the whole thing. And the Flamethrowers, and that did quite well, got translated. The Flamethrowers seems to have been the sort of the poor bastard sort of sibling. And it's only really for the first time that it got translated as an act of love by the guy who translated it. What's his name? Larry Riley, who didn't even speak Spanish, had to teach himself. And that Corona Samizdat brought the 2 halves of the book together for the first time in translation. It was written the first part was published in 1929, so just before the sort of capitalist crisis of what's called market readjustment, that was the Great Depression, and that we periodically suffer from ever since. But after the First World War and the terror and the sort of horrors of particularly gas that was used against men in the trenches there, and this was a book very much seeped in that sort of sensibility of the horrors of modernism. Arlt is Argentinian. This does take place in Buenos Aires, and I think it does a really good job of portraying the sort of the division of wealth in Argentina, that it's a bit of a tin pot industrial revolution that it's had. Literally, sort of the poor workers live in houses where their roofs are made of either tin or zinc, whereas one of the characters, who's a pimp and very successful, lives in the posh area, and there it is, iron and steel. And I think in the early pages, the picture it paints of Buenos Aires is really, really good. But what's it about? Well, it has quite a large cast of characters. Most of them don't have names. They are called things like the astrologer, the man who saw the midwife, the melancholic ruffian, which sort of suggests that there's only one aspect to their sort of character, which is, I think they are archetypes, but they're modern archetypes, have nothing to do with myth and all that Jungian stuff and all that sort of primitive, storytelling. These are very much situated in the early 20th century. They're new archetypes, if you like, and I think that's very well done in here. That for all this cast of characters, there are two that you kind of are the mainsprings of the action. I mean, the others do get their own sort of subplots as well, but the two you really follow are the astrologer, who is a man who wants to burn the world down. He's a revolutionary. He doesn't care where he's not sort of an ideologue. He doesn't care where he gets his ideas from. He actually sort of says a bit of Lenin, bit of Mussolini's fascism, a bit of what religion gives you. He'll take whatever lie or truth is going to help him advance his cause, and that cause is basically to burn the world down, sort of James Bond villain style, and just have a few elites, including him obviously, and his gang of 7 madmen. Adrosian is the other main character, he is an inventor and an engineer. He's married to a well-off woman, sort of basically lives off her, but she's complaining about the money situation, and he gets a job, and he's a debt collector for import-export, I think. I can't remember exactly what they were. But he can't help himself, and he's been embezzling, and they've caught him, and the book, or his story, starts with him saying, right, you've got 24 hours to basically put the money back. So he's got to find this money, and he ends up meeting, he knows the astrologer, but when he's gone to visit him, there's a guy there called the melancholy ruffian, who is the pimp, who has 3 women working under him. He makes loads of money, and the pimp advances in the money to sort out his little difficulty at the workplace. And at this meeting, he discovers the astrologer has basically put together a gang of the elite people he wants to lead this revolution. Adrosian's already part of this, but in meeting the melancholy ruffian, he realises that there are others. This is a go. And what the astrologer wants from Adrosian is to manufacture mass poison gas and lots of other sort of. Basically, he's going to run the economy, the industrial economy in this new society, which is a slave economy pretty much. But there you go. So that's the sort of the setup, and the action doesn't take place over very long, probably no more than a couple of weeks, and we go in and out of these characters' sort of visions and dreams. They're all big dreamers, none less than Adrosian, who has these huge dreams. But the squalid nature of these people is that basically, it's not rooted. Their dreams aren't really rooted in anything. But they haven't really done all that much to advance their plans. I mean, they've got it sort of theoretically sort of planned out in their heads, but they're doing nothing to advance it. And the squalid nature of them is that really what it comes down to is they're just going to act at an individual level, on a criminal, psychopathic level, really. So they're not going to sort of burn down the world. They're going to burn down people in their local neighbourhood to their own personal advantage. And I think that switch, as you gradually realise that, this is what it all boils down to, their sort of petty grievances and rivalries and grudges, is about what it amounts to. There's a lot of nihilism in this book, I feel. And particularly the astrologer is just sort of playing at it. He's just exploiting people's gullibility. There's a point where he sort of says, I'd like to know if you're an actor, a cynic or an adventurer. Those three things are pretty much the same. And that describes him. He picks and chooses whatever suits him. He is cynical. As I say, it's a work of pessimism, but it's also a work of deep cynicism as well, I feel. There is some nice writing. There's one scene called The Agony of the Melancholy Ruffian after he's been shot in the street, which is brilliantly described and reminded me of William Burroughs' short book, The Last Days of Dutch Shorts. And also, I think this is a pretty good gag here. So one of the characters is called a getter, who is sort of on a mad religious drive. He's having a vision that Jesus is standing before him. A getter's eyes filled. He could only wish there was someone around he could beat up to show the Lord how much he loved him. I think that's very funny, and I think that sort of encapsulates where this book is coming from, really. And just the last bit I want to read is this is the astrologer's vision. If you knew how I've got it thought out, and how I keep going is by seeing how out of whack civilization the 20th century have got people. All those crackpots with no place to fit into society, so much waste energy. Go to the tackiest corner cafe, pick out 2 numbskulls and a cynic, and I'll show you 3 geniuses. Those geniuses don't work, don't do anything. I admit that so far they're only geniuses on paper. But there on paper is the energy that could be tapped up to power a new and dynamic movement. And that's the energy source I want to plug into. And I feel that sort of condenses all the themes of this book, that we are living in a cynical age, religion is on the decline, Nietzsche had pronounced God dead, and there's a lot about Nietzsche and the Superman here. Obviously the astrologer sees himself as a Superman. And this sort of equation of geniuses coming out of the criminally minded, those who are, like Adrosian, who thinks they're too good for society, they shouldn't be wasting their time in these mundane tasks such as debt collecting and trying to scrape enough money together to keep body and mind, healthy. It's almost a sort of a version of futurism that the astrology goes. But because they're from these rather lowly criminal world, that they it only ever stays on the personal and petty level. They're not able to escalate it into a genuine utopia, even if it's a rather horrific vision. And I think that is very well done in the book. I will say at times I found the transitions were patchy. I don't mean the transitions between chapters, because often you're moving from one character's point of view to another and a wholly different set of incidents. But the transitions by a chapter will just start with one character enunciating their ideas to another. And it's always very one-sided. It's not often that it's a genuine debate. And I thought those transitions were a bit clunky, not that brilliantly handled. The other thing it reminded me of was Bertolt Brecht's play, The Resistible Rise of Arturo Ui, which, if you don't know, is a whole analogy to the rise of the Nazis, but set in gangster Chicago with Al Capone and that, whereas Hitler is portrayed, or the Hitler character is portrayed as an Al Capone character. And that, again, the sentiment of that very much reminded me, or this book very much reminded me of that these are petty criminals with dreams of grandiosity that they are unable to fulfill. So, it was pretty good. It's a long read, and I did feel that some of it was a bit sort of just ideas at you, but 4 stars. And on to 3 collections of poetry. The first is British poet Hannah Sullivan. This is called Was It For This? Divided into 3 parts. The first is called Tenants. And it's a brilliant poem about the Grenfell Tower disaster, which, for those outside the UK who don't know, and I'll post a link to my blog post on this that I did a few years ago. Grenfell Tower's in West London, in the richest borough of Kensington and Chelsea in London. It's a royal borough because one of the Kensington Palace is there. But it has a very, very poor, deprived North Kensington sector where I actually lived and worked for many years. And when I worked there, part of my job was at a warehouse owned by the same company, which was in the area called Latimer Road, which is a couple of tube stops away. And that's where this Grenfell Tower, which was just an apartment block, but, you know, it was a tower block, burned down to the ground. And there were 70 plus lives lost. And they were lost due to the fact that the cladding, which is supposed to, be anti-fire, was found to be completely the opposite, that it accelerated the fire. And we have this cladding on many, many of our tower blocks because they were done as a cost-saving measure. And also that most of the people in that block were recent immigrants, that they, the council, the richest council in the UK, sort of stuffed, didn't want immigrants, but, was obliged to take them, to stuff them all in these monstrous tower blocks, out of sight, out of mind of everybody else in their rich houses. And the symbol of Grenfell Tower was a real eyesore. I think I caught a tube that went past it, I don't know, maybe a month after, and this sort of blackened, looks like something out of the landscape in Ukraine after the Russian bombing. It's horrific. I mean, it's now covered up so you can't see it, but and I found the poem to that was really, really good. It's from the point of view of a mother with a young baby who lives near it and unfortunately can see it outside her window. Thereafter I was thinking of the people who were consumed and the children who died in that fire and the lack of justice. So I thought that was really good. And then we come to a really long prose poem bit called Was It For This, which is basically sort of talking about her sort of ageing parents, and I found sort of completely unengaging. I just got nothing from it. And then part 3 is called Happy Birthday, where she's looking at the advance of time and ageing through different birthdays, her own and then her children's and things like that, which was okay. But it was a very mixed bag, this. I think I gave it 3 stars, based on the strength of that first poem, Tenants, which I thought was extraordinarily strong. And then on to The Illustrated Woman by Helen Mort. So this is also in 3 parts. Part 1 is called Skin, and is dominated by poems about tattoos, which is fine. I don't have a problem with that. My debut novel, one of my favourite bits of writing, of my own writing, is I also go on a sort of a riff about tattoos, and in that case also piercings. So I'm not averse to it, but I found that, again, I got very little insight. Nothing new was revealed, and Helen Mort is heavily tattooed herself. I found it surprisingly lacking in insights. There was one bit where a friend of hers, or a friend of whoever's the voices of this collection are, remarks that tattoos on women are sort of ugly because they break up the purity of the female body, and the voice in here retorts, well, no, actually, in a way it sort of preserves the purity, because scar tissue and moles and things like that can be embedded into the pattern and therefore disguised, sort of effectively erased. And I thought that was a sort of an interesting point, but that was the only one. And this is about 33 pages of poems about tattoos, basically. Then we get Skinless, which is the second part, which is basically sort of odes to her newborn child called Alfie. And the problem with that is, one is that parents have private, particularly mothers, but parents have private languages with their children. And it felt a bit like that in here, that what she's referring to is so beyond my understanding, because it's private between her and her son. But then it would veer into sentimentality, that there's, that she observes, or she's thinking of a bear and a bear cub as a parent and a child, and equates that to her. Well, yeah. There's another one called Barn Owl. So she's got out, she's driving with Alfie, and she's seen this barn owl. So she gets out the car to look at the barn owl. Hunched in the driver's seat, the owl rests far in the landscape of her want. The news reports a 3-year-old from New York State has just been saved from weeks lost in the woods. He told his mother how a winged creature watched over him by night, built him a rustling bed of leaves. Truth is a milky thin, a thinness through the trees. I cannot follow it because I hold my son. I only hope this world will feed him. I just found that cloyingly sentimental. And then the third part is called Skinless, and it's devoted a lot to sort of pornography and deep fake stuff. So I just found this whole collection bizarre, really. I didn't get on with it. 2 stars. And the final one, the Polish poet Andrej Kotanski, Poems About My Psychiatrist. Now, this was good fun. I really enjoyed this. They are very short poems, back and forth between the client, who presumably is Kotanski, and the psychiatrist. And it's almost like they're sort of working in sort of Buddhist koans, that they don't follow logic. They certainly don't really respond one to another. The psychiatrist is just in need of psychiatry as much as the main character. So they're going backwards and forwards, not really answering each other. So, for example, there's one which is a well-known thing in psychiatry where they're arguing over the cost of the sessions, because that's taken to be an important stage in Freudianism. How much you value yourself and are you prepared to invest in yourself, all this sort of stuff. That if you look to drive the price down, that you're saying, well, I don't want the most expensive therapist, I'm not worth it. But then there's a really funny poem in response to that. So he said, I know it doesn't matter to you if you get well or not, but it really matters to me to achieve another therapeutical success. So can we come to this sort of arrangement? Now you won't be paying me, I'll be paying you for each session. Well, how much? I asked him. 360. I shook my head, and then I said 400. So, as I say, it's very droll. It's very amusing. It's bashing on psychiatry, really. The psychiatrist is almost more out to lunch than the patient, who is depressed, whereas the psychiatrist is just sort of mad. And as I say, it almost has the form of sort of hurling Buddhist koans back and forth between the two. Very, very good fun. 4 stars. And that's it. As to what I'm currently reading, I'm reading Andrei Kirkov, the Ukrainian author's latest release, translated novel called Jimi Hendrix Live in Lviv. Interestingly, it was first published in 2012, so before any kind of Russian usurpation of Ukrainian territory, which I wasn't aware of, and I think definitely changes how one approaches it and what one sort of is anticipating for it. So hopefully that I will be reviewing that next week or next video. I don't know how much I'm going to go into it because I've been commissioned to review it for a magazine publication, so I'm going to have to think how much I can talk about it and how much I need to say for the written version. Anyway, so till next time, thanks very much.